This is the Fitzy and Whipper with Kate Ritchie podcast.
An important conversation to have around domestic violence, and I think it's a conversation everybody should be having. So we want to put a small warning out there if possibly there's young ones or anybody that may have been affected by this topic, that we're going to have an open and a very honest conversation right now on the show.
I think we need to, because violence towards women it's an alarming social issue that needs to be spoken about at the moment. And Monday night was a very powerful episode of on the ABC of Q&A, because we had politicians on there. We had the Nationals leader, Bridget McKenzie, Labor frontbencher Murray Watt, New South Wales Liberal leader Mark Speakman were on there. But I feel like we've heard from politicians so much and there's just no solutions. Well, they talk about, a Royal Commission and an investigation, but that is expensive, it takes time, and we've heard it all before. One man stepped up. He is Macquarie University's criminologist. His name is Vincent Hurley, and he was very upset and he wanted to have a go at the politicians that were on the show. This was Vincent on Q&A Monday night.
How dare you go into politics in an environment like this when one woman is murdered every 4 days, and all you two can do is immediately talk about politics? That is just disgraceful. Is it any wonder frontline services aren't getting the money that they want? You made the comment we need to listen more. For God's sake, how long do we have to listen to politicians like you and the rest of you high-horsing about we have to have a Royal Commission, we have to do this? Everyone here knows what the answer is.
Okay, so what are they? What are they?
First of all, that man should never have been released on bail. Okay, that is the very first thing that happened. If a male has a history of crimes of violence, of any form of domestic violence, coercion, physical, emotional, they should not have the presumption of bail. So you talk about domestic violence, it is more than just domestic violence. You don't need a Royal Commission. That money needs to go into frontline services now.
Beautifully said.
Yeah, I think what was... sorry to talk over you, Fitzy. I think... And thank you to you. Welcome to the show. Sorry, Dr. Vincent Hurley. And thank you so much, I think, for being so passionate and saying exactly what everyone continues to think, and calling politicians out on when this discussion is opened. It becomes about what the other team's not doing and what we would do rather than posing solutions. So thank you so much for saying it so succinctly and so passionately.
Oh, no, look, that's all for a very, very worthwhile call, and, 30 years overdue at least.
I think can I just jump in there, Fitz? You mentioned 30 years. That's exactly kind of what I've been thinking in recent times, Doctor, because I'll never forget a conversation after the Lint cafe siege. And there was a spokesperson for the police force that came out and said, we need $1 billion if we were going to keep an eye on these lone wolf attacks. And then he said, but do you want to spend that money on a possible lone wolf attack, or do you want to spend that money solving an issue where one woman is killed every week by domestic violence? That was 2014.
Yeah, and please call me Vince. Yeah, that is so true. I mean, I'm gobsmacked at the parliamentarians of all persuasions, state or federal, have all of a sudden realised, oh, wow, we've got a problem. This problem has always been there. And when I read the press release and the transcripts from yesterday's cabinet meetings, they talk about generational change. But you know what? The funding that they gave, whilst it's very welcome and certainly more than justified, that funding only lasts for 5 years. Now, how can they, politicians of any persuasion, talk about generational change when they only funding for 5 years? Since when is a generation 5 years?
Yeah, it is.
It's disgraceful. It is absolutely appalling. They are happy to pour money into AUKUS, as I mentioned, in the Rozelle interchange, because parliamentarians can snip a ribbon and get kudos for that. But when it comes to protecting the lives of women, which doesn't rate, until now, it doesn't rate an election, issue, then they've just simply ignored it. Their minds, and this, I was so, and I still am, so angered by the attitudes of politicians that their politics has polluted their mind to the extent That's just the first thing they went to. And the opposition leader made that just incredibly outrageous suggestion along the lines of, I'm not trauma-informed. I mean, for God's sake, what does that tell us, the women of our society, about the attitudes and the perception of politicians? They are just so out of touch with the main parliament. That's the parliament of the street.
Yeah, and when you talk about not rating, like when you talk about assisting domestic violence issues, and as you just said, it doesn't rate, like it doesn't get people involved, it doesn't get people voting. Isn't that an absolute swipe at the female population, who is half of us, who are all voting? And if you're not a female, you have a mother or a daughter or a friend that
Kate, that is so true. Yep. And you think about the poor orphans, the children that are left behind, who, from that moment on, witnessing that, if they do, or living with the trauma for the rest of their life, it would only take some type of tragic social event after that to send them off the rails psychologically into mental health. But the politicians, they just don't get it. They just don't get it.
Dr. Vince, I want to ask you, okay, so Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has announced that the federal government will commit $925 million over the next 5 years. You said it's not long enough. 5 years is not long enough. But I want to ask you, when you talk about frontline services, but we look at the strong laws that have been brought down on bikies, on terrorists, on coward punchers. Do we need a strike force like what they do with the bikies? And don't get me wrong, I know it's a brutal way to do it, but I think it's needed in this country. Do we need a strike force? That it astounds me, Dr. Vince, that a bikie can jump on a bike, and if he's around someone with the same club colours, you can have a strike force straight onto that person and they can be booked straight away. Yet a man who has a history of violence can drive past his ex's house time after time and no one know what's going on. Do we need a strike force for something like that?
Excellent point. A lot of people don't know about the machinations or the workings of the police, which is totally understandable. But most police stations, and I was a part of it, already have domestic violence arrest teams. Domestic violence arrest teams, and police go out and check on the offender as well as the victim to make sure that the offender is complying with the ABO, for example, and that the victim understands, or if the victim needs help, to call the police. So it's not really, and I take the point, it's not really a policing issue per se.
Okay.
It is a government issue. The government need to put money into, as I said, those frontline mental health and alcohol services and gambling, which are the causes of tension within family.
Gotcha.
And I just get for the women of this world, and what Kate said about half the women, it beggars belief that the parliamentarians of all persuasions have, overlooked women. And a dear friend of mine at Macquarie Uni, who I worked with yesterday, said to me, Lavina, said to me, Vince, if you were anything other than an old white male, if you were a female, your comments would not have been taken seriously, or they would have been dismissed. And I would totally agree with that. Totally agree with it. And Kate is spot on.
Yeah, Vince, can I just ask you something? When I've heard you just now talking about the fact that there are domestic violence units within the police department who go out and check on the offenders and the victims, and they make sure that both those parties are doing what has been advised or what has been kind of implemented, whether that's an AVO. And you say that you're checking on the offender to make sure what they're doing, and then you're checking on the victim to make sure that they
are okay.
That they are okay. What I have found myself thinking a lot about over the last, weeks and months is that I've found myself thinking less about the random attacks, gender-based attacks on women, and more about the attacks on women that happen within relationships or within their own home, whether that's a partner or an ex-partner. And I keep seeing the faces of women on the front of the newspaper who... that I keep seeing it's just so upsetting.
I understand, Kate.
And I'm just sorry. Is that what encourages a woman to do what it is she should do, or what we all think that she should do, is stand up to the offender to keep herself safe. And then by doing that, she becomes less safe.
Yeah, exactly. And I understand the cycle of domestic violence and the emotional bond that the males hold over females, and it gradually creeps up on them. And for the women to make that decision to walk away, they could agonise at that over 6 months. If not
more,
even longer.
don't you think it's more? And I now I'm talking over you, Dr. Vincent, but I just find and I just hope that people listening and who, there's always this discussion about why I can't believe that person would stay with that person, or why don't they just up and go? Yep. Well, I don't think that any of the news that we've seen lately about women being attacked by their ex-partner and not getting the amount of support that they need to make the right decision for themselves and for their family, because it's their God-given right to feel safe. They are entitled to feel safe. To see the stories of these other women who have done that and tried to stand up and tried to move forward, and look how it's turned out for them. Don't ever question why somebody stays with somebody again.
No, it's not their fault. Look at poor Hannah Clark in Queensland several years ago, and that leech on society that doused the whole family in petrol and burnt them all alive. Creatures like that are a leech on society.
Do you know, Dr. Vince, I think the other thing is too, from a guy's point of view, from the average bloke's point of view, and the man on the street and the guy that goes to the pub and has a beer, I think the understanding is, well, I haven't paid it enough attention because it's not me and it's not my mates and it's not my world as such. And I think that's been the dismissive nature of a lot of the thinking. But I think the other point, and I think what Kate's touching on too, is you just don't know what's going on. You've got no idea what's going on behind closed doors, and outside of the headlines that we see and the stats and the numbers, who knows? I mean, who knows what happens next door with the loving couple, at least, that you think have a sturdy and stable relationship, and that's the other scary thing. Nobody knows.
Yeah, and look, that is the unfortunate part of it, that you can't police the private life of individuals behind the scenes, and that's a tragedy within itself. And there's always going to be those creatures in society that prey on the women that do that. And if there was a way of being able to preempt that type of behaviour, then it'd be the golden bullet everyone's looking for. And in many events, it's after the event. It's too late. So I would just like to say to all the girls and women out there listening, that there are people in society that love and care for you, and no matter how hard it might be to break that bond, you and your children deserve far better than being treated as an object or being subjected to any sexual or family violence.
Amazing. Thank you for saying that, because I think that's what people can feel incredibly isolated, and that they don't deserve better, but they absolutely do. They absolutely do. It's their right.
I hope you get a phone call, Dr. Vince. I really do. From our government. I hope they sit you down and they talk to you, because it is points like this. Women need time to go to a women's refuge. They don't need to worry about someone coming out on bail, Dr. Vince, and and not knowing what's going to happen next. Where are we going to go from here? We need answers. We're not getting them from politicians. Your 2 minutes on Q&A the other night, Dr. Vince, was one of the most powerful things I've heard come out of anyone's mouth. So we appreciate and thank you for your time.
No, thanks very much for the opportunity. It's a worthwhile cause and will always be a worthwhile cause. And all the girls and women, just hang in there. You deserve better.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
And you know what, Kate, it is an interesting one, and I understand why you get emotional, because it's a conversation that is hard to have, and it's really confronting to have. So I think for a lot of people are sitting back and thinking, I don't know how to have that conversation.
Well, I haven't known how to have it. And I felt incredibly nervous this morning knowing that we were going to talk about this.
You did well.
Well, you've got
Kate,
you've got a daughter. This is the other thing. You've got to start having this conversation over the next few years.
Yeah, but it's the men too.
I was thinking about that, and she is 9 years old, and at the moment, I'm relatively in control of her, and I can make her decisions and keep her at home. But one day that isn't going to happen, and I would like to think that she's going into a much safer world where there's a lot more support.
Well said. All right, 1-800-RESPECT is the number. If you need to call, you need advice, that's 1-800-737-732.
Fits in Whipper with Kate Ritchie is a Nova podcast. For more great shows like this, download the Nova Player via the App Store or Google Play.
The Nova Player.